By 6:30 every evening, the North Ridge Farmers Market began throwing away what nobody had bought. Not everything in the bins was rotten. Some tomatoes had split along their skins. Heads of lettuce had wilted in the afternoon heat. Peaches had bruised under their own weight. Squash with soft spots, crooked carrots, cracked melons, greens too tired to survive another morning, all of it ended in the same place. Behind the market, Clara Whitlock first noticed the pile because of the smell. She had stayed late one Thursday, hoping a vendor would discount a few boxes of vegetables she could preserve for winter. Instead, behind the loading area, she watched two workers drag heavy containers toward a truck. One tipped sideways. Tomatoes spilled across the pavement. A melon broke open beneath a wheel. Clara stopped. "How much of that do you throw out?" The worker looked at the containers. "This?" He shrugged. "More than you'd want." Clara looked again. That answer bothered her. North Ridge Field sat less than 12 miles away, and every season Clara watched its soil become harder to work. Rain struck the surface and disappeared downhill. During dry weeks, the upper layers lost moisture quickly. She could still grow there, but increasingly it felt as though every harvest required something else to be purchased first. Fertilizer, mulch, compost, another amendment, another delivery, another invoice. Yet here, 12 miles away, trucks were carrying tons of organic material in the opposite direction, and somebody was paying to make it disappear. Clara walked closer to the containers. The smell was stronger there, sweet fruit turning sour, wet leaves collapsing against one another, tomatoes already losing their shape. To everyone working behind the market, it was a disposal problem. Clara didn't yet know what it was. That distinction mattered. She wasn't looking at finished compost. She wasn't looking at fertilizer. And she certainly wasn't looking at some miracle substance that could be dumped onto a field and transform it overnight. She was looking at raw material. But she didn't understand that yet. She picked up one damaged tomato. Half of it was still firm. The other half had collapsed beneath a dark split in the skin. A few hours earlier, that tomato had possessed a price. Now its market value was 0. Clara turned it slowly in her hand. Then she looked at the truck. "How much does it cost you to get rid of all this?" This time, the worker laughed. "Enough." That was the moment the problem changed shape. North Ridge Field needed organic matter Clara could barely afford to keep buying. The market had organic material it was paying someone to remove. 2 problems, 12 miles apart, and Clara Whitlock was beginning to wonder whether they belonged to the same system. The market saw something it had to pay to throw away. Clara saw something her farm could no longer afford to buy. North Ridge Field had never been easy land. Clara knew that. What frightened her was how quietly it had begun consuming everything she earned. At first, the expenses looked ordinary. A load of compost, a few bags of fertilizer, mulch, fuel, another delivery. Nothing dramatic enough to make her panic. But one winter evening, Clara emptied the kitchen drawer where she kept her farm receipts and spread them across the table. The pile kept growing. She moved one receipt aside, then another, then another. Compost, delivery, fertilizer, fuel, more compost, more delivery. Clara stopped adding. For several seconds, she simply stared at the numbers. The previous harvest had looked respectable from the road. That was the cruel part. Anyone driving past North Ridge might have believed the farm was doing fine. Only Clara knew how much money had disappeared beneath those crops before anything ever came out of the ground. She leaned back in the chair. Every season, she seemed to earn the privilege of paying for the next one, and the soil still wasn't improving fast enough. After heavy rain, Clara could watch water race across sections of the field instead of soaking where she wanted it. During dry weeks, exposed ground hardened quickly. She could push a shovel into one area and feel resistance travel straight into her shoulders. Every problem seemed to have something available for purchase. Another product, another amendment, another truck. But Clara had begun to understand something she didn't want to admit. She could keep treating symptoms. She couldn't keep financing them forever. That was why the discarded vegetables behind the market would not leave her mind. 12 miles away, North Ridge desperately needed more organic material. And 12 miles in the opposite direction, people were paying to haul organic material away. Clara stood at the edge of the field several days later and drove her shovel into the ground. She broke the soil apart in her palm. What she wanted wasn't simply more fertilizer. She wanted ground that behaved differently. Ground that accepted water. Ground that held moisture longer. Ground with structure. Ground that didn't demand another purchase every time conditions became difficult. But improving acres of soil required enormous quantities of material, and enormous quantities cost money. Money, Clara was beginning to fear she simply didn't have. She looked toward the road leading into town. That evening, the market would close again. More tomatoes would split. More lettuce would wilt. Another disposal truck would arrive. For years, Clara had been asking, "What can I afford to buy for North Ridge?" Standing there, with soil crumbling through her fingers, she finally asked something else. What if the thing I can't afford to buy is something someone else is already paying to throw away? The first load looked much worse at North Ridge than it had behind the market. At the loading dock, the discarded produce had seemed almost useful boxes of bruised fruit, wilted greens, damaged vegetables, things that had simply reached the end of their selling life. Dumped beside Clara's field, it looked like garbage. There was no avoiding that. Tomatoes burst when the first container was tipped. Lettuce collapsed into wet layers. Melons rolled beneath broken squash. Peaches disappeared under cabbage leaves and carrot tops. Within minutes, flies found it. Clara stood beside the trailer with her gloves stained red from tomato pulp and felt the first uncomfortable gap between an idea and a system. She had arranged to take only a trial load. That suddenly seemed wise. The logic in her head had been simple. These vegetables had grown from soil. They were organic. They would decompose. And decomposed organic material could eventually return something useful to soil. So Clara chose a corner away from the main growing area and began piling it, bucket after bucket, crate after crate. The pile grew faster than she expected. By evening, what had been a disposal problem behind the market had become a 6-foot problem on her farm. Still, Clara felt something close to victory. For once, she hadn't bought the material. No invoice for compost. No expensive delivery of finished soil amendment. The market had wanted it gone, and North Ridge needed organic inputs. The connection seemed almost embarrassingly obvious. She covered what she could and went home. By the next afternoon, the pile had settled. 2 days later, it had settled again. Then the smell changed. It wasn't the earthy smell Clara associated with finished compost. It was sharp, sour, heavy. When she pulled back the top layer, the vegetables beneath had collapsed into a wet mass. Tomato skins slid away under her gloves. Greens had compressed into dense mats. Liquid collected near the bottom. The flies multiplied. Clara added another layer of produce, thinking perhaps the pile simply needed more time. That made it worse. On the 4th morning, she could smell it before she reached it. She stopped 20 yards away. For the first time since making the arrangement with the market, Clara wondered whether everyone else had been right. Maybe waste was waste for a reason. Maybe she hadn't discovered free fertility. Maybe she had simply volunteered to move somebody else's disposal problem 12 miles down the road. She approached the pile and pushed a fork into its center. The material came apart wet and heavy. There was decomposition everywhere, but nothing about it resembled the dark, crumbly compost she had paid good money for in previous seasons. That difference bothered her more than the smell. Clara had assumed that because the material was rotting, it was becoming what her field needed. Standing beside that leaking pile, she realized those were not necessarily the same thing. She had solved the transportation problem. She had not solved the biological one. And if she couldn't understand the difference, North Ridge wasn't going to receive living soil. It was going to receive several tons of rotten vegetables. By the end of the week, Clara had stopped using the word compost. Calling it compost felt dishonest. What she had was a 6-foot heap of collapsing vegetables that smelled worse every morning. She drove a fork into one side. A heavy sheet of lettuce, crushed tomatoes, and softened fruit folded outward. Liquid collected underneath. Flies lifted into the air. Clara turned her face away. The embarrassment hurt more than the smell. Only days earlier, she had felt clever bringing the first load home. The market was paying to get rid of something her farm needed. It had seemed so obvious. Now she imagined someone from town seeing the pile. They wouldn't see an innovative farmer. They would see a woman who had hauled somebody else's garbage onto her own land. For one uncomfortable moment, Clara considered ending the experiment. Call the market. Tell them not to send another load. Clean up the mess. Forget the entire thing. But before walking away, she pushed the fork deeper into the center. Warm material came apart in heavy clumps. Something was happening, just not the thing she wanted. That distinction stopped her. Clara had assumed decomposition and composting were effectively the same process. Vegetables rotted. Organic matter broke down. Eventually, soil benefited. Simple. Except the pile in front of her was proving that the path between those ideas mattered. Most of the discarded produce was wet and soft. Packed together beneath its own weight, it collapsed. Air disappeared. Moisture accumulated. The conditions changed. Clara began reading instead of guessing. Carbon, nitrogen, moisture, oxygen, structure, microorganisms. She looked back at the heap. Suddenly the smell wasn't simply a failure. It was information. The wet bottom was information. The compressed layers were information. The experiment wasn't telling Clara that the vegetables were useless. It was telling her that vegetables alone weren't a system. So she made a decision that would have seemed absurd several days earlier. She stopped accepting produce. Not permanently, until she understood what was missing. For the next few days, Clara searched North Ridge and the surrounding area for materials almost opposite to what the market supplied. Dry leaves, old straw, wood chips, coarse plant residue, things nobody considered particularly valuable. She loaded them anyway. Then she returned to the rotting heap and spread the first brown layer across the top. Nothing miraculous happened. The smell didn't vanish. The farm wasn't saved. But Clara felt something she hadn't felt since the pile began collapsing. Control. Her first idea had been to rescue waste. Her second was far more important. Create the conditions that allowed biology to do something useful with it. Rotting was easy. Building soil required management. After the failure of the first load, Clara stopped searching for a perfect compost recipe. She wanted one, a number she could write on the barn wall. 3 buckets of this, 1 bucket of that. Mix. Wait. Done. But the market refused to cooperate. One Tuesday's load was mostly lettuce. Thursday brought squash and damaged cabbage. Another evening, several cracked melons arrived together, releasing so much water that Clara knew immediately the mixture would behave differently. Nothing was consistent. At first, that frustrated her. Then it forced her to become better. Clara spread coarse, dry material beneath the next load. Straw, leaves, wood chips, then the vegetables, then another brown layer. Instead of burying everything beneath more waste, she mixed the materials together. The difference could be felt almost immediately. The pile had texture, space, resistance beneath the fork. The wet vegetables could no longer collapse so easily into one dense mass. But Clara refused to celebrate. She remembered the smell of her first attempt too clearly. For several days, she checked the new pile every morning. Too wet? More dry material. Compressed? Open it. Too dry? The process slowed. A bad smell? Something needed attention. Clara began realizing that the pile behaved almost like the field itself. You couldn't command it. You had to notice what it was telling you. Then one cold morning she walked toward the compost area and saw something rising through the air. Steam. Clara slowed. She pulled back part of the outer layer. More warmth escaped. For a second, the memory of the first sour heap returned and her stomach tightened. She leaned closer. The smell was different. Not finished compost. Not the dark earthy material she had once paid to have delivered. But not the suffocating odor of her first failure either. Clara stood motionless while the steam disappeared into the morning air. It was a small moment. No one else was there. No one applauded. Nothing on North Ridge had changed yet. But Clara smiled. The first truckload had proven only that she could obtain discarded vegetables. This was the first evidence that she might actually learn how to transform them. And that changed the meaning of everything behind the market. Those dumpsters had never contained free fertilizer. Clara understood that now. They contained one ingredient. Her first mistake had been expecting an ingredient to behave like a solution. The value appeared only when she connected it with what it lacked. Wet with dry, soft material with structure, nitrogen-rich material with carbon, moisture with oxygen, waste with attention. Clara looked toward North Ridge. For years, she had waited for soil improvement to arrive on a truck with an invoice attached. Now, for the first time, She was watching part of it begin in a pile she had almost given up on. The change was easy to miss from the road. To anyone driving past North Ridge, Clara was still standing, beside a heap of discarded vegetables and brown plant material. But Clara knew something fundamental had changed. She was no longer making a pile. She was managing a process. Every morning before working the field, she checked it. She watched the moisture. She noticed where material had compressed. She turned sections when they needed more air. When a new load from the market arrived unusually wet, she didn't simply dump it onto the top anymore. She adjusted. More dry material, more structure, more attention to what the pile was telling her. The first attempt had taught Clara that adding more material wasn't always progress. Sometimes progress meant slowing down. One cold morning, she walked toward the pile before sunrise. Frost covered the grass around it. She pushed her fork through the outer layer and opened the center. Steam rose into the morning air. Clara stopped. For a moment, she simply watched. Weeks earlier, heat had frightened her because it came from a sour, collapsing mass she didn't understand. Now the warmth meant something different. Microorganisms were breaking down the material, and their activity was generating heat. The pile was alive with a process she couldn't see directly. That fascinated her. She began checking temperature instead of guessing from the steam alone. She watched how conditions changed after turning the material, after adding a wet load, and after introducing more dry, carbon-rich matter. Slowly, the pile became predictable enough to manage. Not perfectly. One section dried too much. Another compacted after several boxes of damaged melons arrived together. A batch containing unwanted packaging cost her hours of sorting. Each mistake added another rule. Don't accept everything simply because it's free. Don't confuse volume with value. Don't assume yesterday's mixture will work for today's load. And never stop paying attention to air and moisture. The market supplied ingredients. Clara supplied management. Biology did the transformation. That distinction became the foundation of everything that followed. Over time, individual vegetables became harder to recognize. The bright reds and greens faded. Soft fruit collapsed. Leaves lost their shape. The pile settled, but unlike Clara's first attempt, it wasn't turning into a foul pool beneath its own weight. She lifted a handful from one section and rubbed it between her gloves. It wasn't finished compost yet. Clara knew better than to call it that, but it was moving in the right direction. She looked toward North Ridge. For years, every improvement on that field had seemed to arrive on a receipt. This was different. Money alone wasn't creating what sat before her. Observation was, adjustment was, time was, and billions of organisms too small for Clara to see were doing work no truck could deliver already finished. That morning, she finally understood the real opportunity behind the market. The discarded vegetables weren't valuable because they were free. They were valuable because, managed correctly and combined with the right materials, they could feed a biological process. Clara hadn't discovered free soil. She had discovered something more useful, a way to begin building it. By the third week, Clara could no longer find the tomatoes. She knew they had been there. She remembered unloading them. Red skins, crushed fruit, juice running between the straw. But when she turned the pile now, most of them had disappeared into something darker. The lettuce was losing its shape. Yellow straw had turned brown. Peach flesh had vanished. Even the boundary between material from town and material from North Ridge was becoming difficult to see. Clara stopped turning for a moment. That fascinated her. At the market, everything depended on identity. A tomato was worth money because someone wanted a tomato. A peach had value because somebody wanted to eat a peach. Damage it badly enough and that value collapsed. But inside the compost pile, those prices meant nothing. Microorganisms did not know whether a melon had sold for $4 or been thrown away for nothing. They responded only to conditions. And under the right conditions, the rejected produce began losing the identities that had once determined whether people considered it valuable. For Clara, there was something strangely emotional about watching that happen. Months earlier, she had stood behind the market holding a split tomato that nobody wanted. Now she couldn't even find it. It hadn't vanished. It had entered something larger. Still, Clara had learned enough not to rush. A smaller pile wasn't necessarily finished. Dark material wasn't automatically mature compost. Vegetables becoming unrecognizable did not mean she should spread the material across North Ridge. So she waited. She turned it, checked it, let the intense heat rise and gradually settle. Then one morning she lifted a handful. It crumbled differently between her gloves. The sour smell was gone. Clara squeezed the material gently. Every instinct in her wanted to believe she had succeeded, but she stopped herself. Making something that looked like compost had never been the real goal. North Ridge was the goal. If the material didn't improve how that soil functioned, then the entire experiment was just an elaborate way of making waste look nicer. So Clara walked into the field and marked 2 neighboring strips. One would receive the compost, one would receive nothing. Same field, same rain, same weather, one difference. She stood between the 2 strips, looking back toward the compost pile. The experiment had changed again. She was no longer asking, "Can rotten vegetables disappear?" She knew the answer. Now came the question that could justify every foul-smelling morning, every load hauled from town, and every hour spent turning the pile. Could what remained help North Ridge become soil? Clara no longer had to fight every season. Clara chose the smallest piece of North Ridge she could take seriously. Not 10 acres, not 5. Just a controlled patch large enough to show her something, but small enough that a mistake wouldn't cost her another season. She marked 2 neighboring strips. One received the finished compost, the other didn't. Then, she waited. For the first few days, there was nothing dramatic to see. No sudden explosion of green, no miraculous transformation. The field looked almost exactly as it had before. That was important. Clara had already learned what happened when she confused hope with evidence, so instead of staring at the plants, she watched the ground. Then the rain came. It wasn't a major storm, just enough to soak the upper soil. The following morning, Clara walked both strips. She crouched first in the untreated section and pushed her fingers beneath the surface. Then she crossed to the compost-treated patch. She did the same thing. Something was different. Small, but noticeable. The amended surface was easier to work. The layer beneath it seemed to retain moisture differently. Where parts of the untreated ground tended to harden after drying, the treated soil began developing a texture Clara hadn't been accustomed to seeing there. She didn't call it proof. Not yet. One rain could lie. One good week could lie. Even one good season could make a farmer believe something that weather had actually done. So Clara kept watching. As the weeks passed, she repeated the same ritual. After rain, after dry weather, before irrigation, after irrigation. She dug. She squeezed soil in her hand. She compared one strip with the other, and gradually, the difference became harder to dismiss. The compost wasn't acting like some instant fertilizer poured onto a crop. It was changing the environment in which the crop had to live. Organic matter could influence aggregation, water behavior, and nutrient-holding processes while providing material for soil organisms. None of those changes turned bad ground into perfect soil overnight. But together, they could change how a field functioned. That was what Clara had been missing. For years, she had judged North Ridge mostly by what grew above it. Now she was learning to judge it by what happened underneath. She pushed a shovel into the treated strip and lifted a slice. The moment was almost disappointingly ordinary. No crowd, no newspaper, no one from the market standing beside her. Just Clara, a shovel, and a small patch of ground. Yet it mattered more than the steaming compost pile had. The steam had shown her that decomposition was working. This showed her where the value might ultimately go. She crumbled the soil between her fingers. Then she looked toward the rest of North Ridge. There were acres beyond that little test. Acres that would require far more material, far more hauling, far more carbon, far more labor, and far more control over what arrived from town. The small patch hadn't solved Clara's problem. In some ways, it had made the problem larger. Because now she had enough evidence to consider scaling. And scaling meant that the word free was about to become dangerously misleading. Still, Clara allowed herself one thought before walking back toward the compost area. The first crop she was trying to grow wasn't corn, squash, or vegetables. It was soil structure. And for the first time, North Ridge seemed to be answering. The first successful patch created a dangerous temptation. Clara wanted more. More compost meant more ground she could treat. More ground meant a better chance of changing North Ridge at a scale large enough to matter. So when the market offered additional loads, Clara said yes, then yes again. Within weeks, the weakness in her new system appeared. Free material was not free. The first cost was fuel. Every trip between the market and North Ridge required a truck, time, loading, unloading, and someone willing to do the work. The second cost was worse. Contamination. Clara opened one load and found plastic bags tangled through wilted greens. Another contained produce stickers, packaging, ties, and pieces of material he didn't want scattered through compost that might eventually reach her fields. She spent an afternoon sorting by hand, then another. Standing beside a growing pile of rejected plastic, Clara realized she had discovered a new kind of waste inside the waste. The market measured its problem by weight. Clara had to measure hers by quality. That changed the arrangement. She could no longer be the person who simply took whatever nobody else wanted. If the system was going to grow, the material had to be separated before it reached North Ridge. So, Clara went back to the market. She asked for something that initially sounded inconvenient. Cleaner collection. Produce in designated containers. Packaging kept separate whenever possible. No assumption that every discarded item automatically belonged on her farm. The goal wasn't to collect the most waste. It was to collect the right waste. Some vendors understood immediately. Others didn't. To them, Clara was complicating something that had previously been simple. Throw it away and let somebody else deal with it. But Clara had already learned what happened when somebody else's disposal problem became hers. She began rejecting unsuitable loads. That surprised people. Why would a woman who wanted free material turn free material away? Because she no longer thought of it as free. Every contaminated load demanded labor. Every unnecessary trip burned fuel. Every poorly sorted batch threatened the consistency of the compost she had spent months learning to manage. And volume created another problem. A few crates could be handled with improvisation. Tons could not. Clara needed space, a routine, enough carbon-rich material ready before wet loads arrived. A plan for bad weather. A way to prevent the entire operation from becoming the same uncontrolled heap she had created at the beginning. The lesson was uncomfortable but valuable. Waste only became a resource when the system around it worked. One evening, Clara stood beside several neatly separated containers waiting to be processed. Months earlier, she would have celebrated simply because they cost her nothing. Now she saw the hidden expenses attached to everyone. Transport, sorting, carbon, labor, time, management, and strangely, that made the idea stronger rather than weaker. Because Clara was no longer chasing a fantasy about free fertilizer. She was building a system that acknowledged the real costs of transformation. The market had taught her to see discarded produce as raw material. North Ridge had taught her something harder. A resource isn't defined by what you pay to acquire it. It's defined by what you can responsibly turn it into. By the second season, Clara stopped thinking of the market as a source of free vegetables. She rarely even used the word free anymore. Instead, she began noticing movement. Every morning, produce traveled into town. Boxes arrived. Crates were unloaded. Customers bought what looked good. Restaurants took what they could use. Then evening came. A split tomato suddenly traveled in the opposite direction. So did wilted lettuce, overripe peaches, damaged squash. Food worth hauling into town in the morning became material worth paying to haul away by night. One evening, Clara stood behind the market watching the process again. She remembered the question that had controlled nearly every difficult season at North Ridge. What do I need to buy? Fertilizer? Compost? Mulch? Some new amendment? She had asked that question so often that it had begun to feel like farming itself. Now another question had replaced it. What is already moving through this community that North Ridge can use? Once Clara began thinking that way, she couldn't stop seeing possibilities. Leaves collected each autumn. Clean wood chips from tree crews. Old straw. Crop residue. Plant material that had finished one job but might still perform another. She didn't accept everything. The plastic bags, contaminated loads, and wasted fuel of the previous season had cured her of that mistake. Instead, every material had to earn its place. What did it contribute? What would it cost to move? Could she process it safely? Did she have enough dry carbon? Enough space? Enough labor? Enough time? Clara's breakthrough was no longer about discovering more garbage. It was about connecting materials that made sense together. Market scraps entered wet. Dry carbon balanced them. The pile was managed. Decomposition ran its course. Finished compost reached the field. Then Clara observed what happened and adjusted the next cycle. For the first time, Northridge stopped feeling like the endpoint of an endless chain of purchases. It became part of a loop. That realization was bigger than Clara had expected. She had begun this because she was worried about money, because a pile of receipts on her kitchen table had made the future of the farm feel smaller. But somewhere between the first rotten load and the first improved patch of soil, the project had become something different. Not a trick for getting free fertilizer. Infrastructure, not concrete, not machinery. Relationships, timing, biology. Repeated movement. A year earlier, Clara watched trucks leave the market and saw waste. Now, she saw unfinished journeys. Grow, sell, reject, decompose, return, grow again. The moment she changed the question, the end of one system became the beginning of another. The change at Northridge was frustratingly slow. Clara sometimes wished it weren't. After everything she had hauled, turned, sorted, and waited for, part of her wanted the field to reward her with something dramatic. A sudden wall of green, a harvest twice as large. Some unmistakable sign that all the work had been worth it. Northridge gave her nothing that easy. Instead, the evidence arrived quietly. A shovel entering one treated section with less resistance. Ground remaining workable longer after rain. Moisture lingering differently beneath the surface. Soil beginning to crumble in Clara's hand. Instead of breaking into the hard pieces, she remembered. Small things. The kind of things no passing driver would notice. Clara noticed. She had spent too many years fighting the field not to. One afternoon, she returned to the original test strip. She pushed the shovel down and lifted a section of soil. For a moment, she just looked at it. There was no miracle there. Northridge still had weak ground. Weather still dictated more than Clara wanted. Some areas would need years of work. Compost had not turned difficult land into perfect soil. But Clara no longer needed perfection to recognize progress. She reached down and crumbled the soil around the roots. Then she remembered the winter night when invoices covered her kitchen table. Back then, every soil problem appeared to have a price attached. A crop needed nutrients. Buy something. The ground dried too quickly. Buy something. The surface needed protection. Buy something else. That pattern had slowly convinced Clara that fertility was something delivered to a farm. Compost had forced her to see another possibility. Organic matter wasn't simply another product. Once incorporated into a functioning system, it could participate in structure, water behavior, nutrient cycling, and biological activity. The important word was participate. No single bag could do everything. No single truckload could build a mature soil system overnight. That required roots, organic residues, microorganisms, water, air, protection, time, and someone willing to keep managing the process long after the exciting part of the story was over. Clara closed her fingers around the soil. That was when the title of the entire experiment finally made sense to her. The soil she had wanted all those years was something she could never simply purchase and unload. She could buy compost. She could buy fertilizer. She could buy amendments. But she could not order a mature living soil system by the truckload. She had to build the conditions for one. And beneath her hand, Northridge was finally beginning to build with her. By the third season, the most visible change at Northridge wasn't in the field. It was on the road. Clara remembered the first evening behind the market, watching workers push containers of spoiled produce toward a disposal truck. Back then, everything moved in one direction, away. Once a tomato couldn't be sold, its journey was effectively over. Once lettuce wilted beyond a customer's patience, it became something the market wanted removed. Now some of those materials traveled a different road, toward Northridge. The change hadn't happened because Clara convinced everyone that rotten vegetables were valuable. She had proven something more practical. With proper separation, suitable carbon-rich materials, controlled composting, and enough time, part of that organic waste stream could become a useful soil-building input. And that changed the conversation. At first, vendors had asked Clara why she wanted their waste. Now some asked a different question. How much can you take? Clara was careful with her answer. Only what she could process. That distinction mattered. She had learned that taking everything would destroy the system faster than taking nothing. So containers were separated more carefully. Unsuitable materials were rejected. Incoming loads had to match the carbon supplies, space, labor, and composting capacity available at North Ridge. The goal was never to make the largest pile. The goal was to complete the cycle. One afternoon, Clara watched a truck turn through the farm gate carrying another load from town. For a moment, she remembered those old invoices on her kitchen table. There was an irony she couldn't ignore. Years earlier, Clara had paid trucks to bring soil amendments toward North Ridge. The market had paid to send unwanted organic material away. Both sides had been spending money while valuable biological material moved. Through a system that treated disposal and soil fertility as unrelated problems, Clara had connected them. Not perfectly, not for free, and certainly not without work, but enough to change what those truckloads meant. The real reversal wasn't that waste had suddenly become expensive. It wasn't that Clara had discovered some secret treasure hidden inside rotten tomatoes. The reversal was simpler. Something once defined entirely by the cost of removing it now had another possible destination. And North Ridge, once dependent on purchased inputs, had begun building part of what it needed from a local cycle. The truck stopped beside the composting area. Clara watched the first container come down. Bruised tomatoes, wilted greens, split fruit. Almost exactly what she had seen years earlier. The material hadn't changed. The system around it had. Once, people had asked Clara, "Why would you bring that garbage onto your farm?" Now the question was, "Can you use another load?"